This morning we're going to continue on in the Philippian letter, beginning at verse 14. Most of the brothers in the Lord have gained confidence from my imprisonment and dare even more to speak the message fearlessly. Some, to be sure, preach Christ out of envy and strife, but others out of goodwill. These do so out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. The others proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, seeking to cause me trouble in my imprisonment. What does it matter? Just that in every way, whether out of false motives or true, Christ is proclaimed. And in this I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice. This morning I want to begin backwards. I want to start with where Paul ends and then look at the amazing way he gets there. First, remember that Paul has shared that he possesses an overwhelming sense of joy in the truth that his calamity, his imprisonment, is producing an advancement of the gospel. Advancement is kind of an interesting word. I didn't go into this when we covered this before, but it actually has a military application. It was used of how a scouting group would be sent ahead of the troops. And they would be called upon to perhaps clear pathways or to observe what lied ahead and determine the exact path that they would travel. What Paul is saying here is that his imprisonment is a military scout that's going ahead of the gospel, and it's clearing the way, it's preparing the way for the gospel to advance. And that perhaps gives us a unique picture of Paul's perception of what it meant for his calamity to bring about that kind of advancement. Paul is viewing all of the perspectives of his imprisonment as containing the joyful advancement of the gospel. Even the preaching of those who were seeking to belittle his efforts, he considers a worthy advancement, preparation of the gospel. He says in verse 18, what does it matter? But that in every way, whether out of false motives or true, Christ is proclaimed. And this I rejoice, yes, and I will rejoice. Let's look at some of those phrases. What does it matter? What does it matter? The phrase shows the depth of Paul's joy in the advancement of the gospel. The fact that the gospel was being preached and being shared. Matthew Henry's commentary says this: Paul was so far from envying those who had liberty to preach the gospel while he was under confinement, that he rejoiced in the preaching of it, even by those who do it in pretense and not in truth. Paul was able to say, it doesn't matter if they're motivated because they are despising me being in prison, the gospel's being preached. And he finds joy in that. Whether out of false motives is one of the comments he makes there. Prophasis, outwards, showing pretext. It's compounded from a word to mean in front and lighten. The idea is someone is seeking to light their own way. Someone is approaching this in arrogance. It's all about them. They're wanting to be seen. They're wanting the limelight. And so Paul says, some folks are motivated because of my imprisonment to preach the gospel so that they can get the limelight. And that's what he's rejoicing in. Truth. The Greek word is made up of a compound word with the which negates the word, and the second part of it is to lie. So the truth is that which is not lying. So Paul said these people are proclaiming, they are preaching the truth. They don't have any hidden agenda as far as the gospel is concerned. The truth is what they are proclaiming. And then he says, because of this I rejoice, yes, and I will continue to rejoice. It's kind of interesting if one looks in the original language. There's just one Greek word that appears for the entire phrase, rejoice, and yes, I will continue to rejoice. It's just a single Greek word. But because of all of the grammatical structure in the word, it literally is a double translation. It means not only I will rejoice, but it means I will continue to rejoice. So Paul says, even though these individuals are trying to do me harm by proclaiming this from impure motives, they're proclaiming the truth, I will rejoice. And by the way, I will continue to rejoice in the fact that that's happening. The idea within the structure is I do rejoice, and I am resolved to keep on rejoicing, even if their spiteful preaching, left out of G, continues. Paul's great joy is in the advancement of the gospel. Most of the brothers in the Lord have gained confidence from my imprisonment and dare even more to speak the message fearlessly. Some, to be sure, preach Christ out of envy and strife, but others out of goodwill. Those who do so out of love, knowingly that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. The others proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, seeking to cause me trouble. So we're working our way backwards. Paul says, I rejoice the gospel's being preached, whether people are doing it out of love or out of spite. Doesn't matter. Gospel's being proclaimed. But then he talks about this group of people who are proclaiming the gospel out of love. Now, I think we need to understand something that maybe we don't think about very often, and that is that Paul here is talking about a specific group of people. And his sphere of influence at this particular time is very limited. He's in prison. Where is he in prison? He's in prison in Rome. We know that the Philippian church has been concerned about him. They've sent money, they've sent Epaphroditus. There's not much else going on. Paul talks about being deserted when he writes to Timothy. There's not a lot of other churches that are staying in touch with this prisoner, Paul. So it's a pretty safe assumption to assume that when Paul talks about the brothers who are preaching out of love, he's talking about Romans. He's talking about Christians at Rome. But he's not saying, somebody out at Corinth still loves me, and no, he's kind of talking about this particular body. This is not the day of cell phones. There's not this mass communication traveling worldwide where he knows what's going on. His sphere of understanding is somewhat limited to where he's at. So it's a pretty safe assumption to assume that when he talks about most of the brothers are speaking more courageously, he's talking about the people in Rome. He's talking about the Christians in this Roman body. Some of Paul's joy is centered in the reality that his imprisonment has caused most of the brothers to become brave in spreading the gospel. Most of the church in Rome has viewed Paul's imprisonment as an encouragement to speak the message with boldness. There's actually among several preachers, denominational and otherwise, there's kind of a catchphrase right now that is being proclaimed and talked about in sermons and written about. And this is it. The church needs to change from being an audience into an army. And you think about what maybe some of that implies. That we've become comfortable in our Christianity being a spectator sport. We come and sit, we listen, we hear, we participate a little bit. But be the army of the Lord? That sometimes seems to be out of reach of what most Christians are considering. I think what Paul is saying is that his imprisonment has turned the church at Rome in from being a group of audience participants into being warriors. That they're not afraid. Their process may be something like this. If Paul is sharing the gospel while in prison because of the gospel, and if Paul's shared gospel is converting folks within Caesar's house, then surely we can muster the courage to share it with those we know. If Paul is doing this with all of the stuff that is around him and it's being fruitful, why are we being quiet? And so it's turned him into an army. And Paul says, most of the brothers. He's talking about the majority of the church has been motivated to do this. They're motivated by goodwill. The text says they're doing this out of love. This is a descriptive of their feelings towards Paul. The original word is compounded from well and think of, and the root word to show. So what it is they're wanting to show that they think well of Paul. And they're motivated to share the gospel because of that. Some taught because they thought well of Paul, and they wanted to show that they did. These do it out of love. Obviously, the Greek word is agape. The question is, love for whom? Paul says these people are preaching out of love. And I don't think it's talking about their love for God, although obviously they have a love for God. I think the context demands us to consider this as these people love Paul. And the reason I say that is because he talks about those who seek to do him harm. So I think the love here is the love that is being given towards Paul. It's their love for Paul that is providing the specific motivation for them to share the gospel. He says that what they know is that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. Literally, the idea is that Paul has been stretched out. He's been laid out for the purpose of defending the gospel. Defense is the Greek word apologia, from which we get our English word apologetics, which is the word that literally means to give an account for oneself or to defend. And so apologetics is the process of defending the gospel. By the way, this is free. When you go to someone because you've done them wrong, do not apologize. Because you know what you're doing if you apologize? You're defending yourself. Don't say, I apologize. Say what your folks always said you're supposed to say. I'm sorry. Words mean things. Maybe that reveals a little something to us. Okay, this whole thing could mean that they saw Paul incarcerated, stretched out for the gospel, and the gospel still needed to be proclaimed, so guess what? We're going to have to do this. Paul's locked up. He's not able to do what he once was able to do. He's incarcerated because of the gospel, and we need to step up to the plate. That may be what it means. It also could mean that they saw Paul continuing to present the gospel while he was stretched out, while he was defending the gospel. And so they thought, you know what? If Paul can do that, so can we. If he can be in that negative environment, share the gospel, have the gospel be the power of God unto salvation to those even in Caesar's house, why can't we do that? They are sharing the gospel because of love. Obviously, for Paul to know that someone loved him so much as to take up the banner of sharing the gospel was an immense encouragement and would have greatly contributed to his ability to continue to find joy amid his own calamity. How powerful that was for Paul to enjoy. But the text lets us know not everyone thought of Paul that way. Some, to be sure, preach Christ out of envy and strife, but others out of goodwill. These do so out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. The others proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, seeking to cause me trouble in my imprisonment. What does it matter? Just that in every way, whether out of false motives or true, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice, yes, and I will rejoice. So let's talk about those who wanted to preach so that they could hurt Paul. Some loved Paul, wanted to honor him, his situation, by preaching the gospel. Others saw Paul imprisoned, and they took advantage of it. They saw it as a means, an opportunity to belittle his authority, his ability, his work. And they took advantage of that and decided they were going to preach the gospel. The text uses a couple of words. It says, Paul says, some are going to do this out of envy and strife. Envy is ill will. It is from the root that means to shrivel, to wither, to spoil, to ruin. Some are out to ruin Paul. And they're motivated to preach the gospel so that Paul might be shriveled up as an apostle, as a spiritual authority. Strife means to start a quarrel, to wrangle. So not only are they wanting to take away Paul's influence, to spoil his influence, they're wanting to preach the gospel, to teach the truth, so that they can develop a quarrel about Paul. Out of envy and strife. They also, Paul says, out of rivalry, not sincerely, they want to cause me trouble. Rivalry means a factious intrigue to stimulate anger. There's a group of people who just want to stir things up. And Paul says they're motivated to preach the gospel just to stir things up, to make things difficult for Paul. Not sincerely, made up of adding the word not and purity. The root word means honesty or modesty, to be innocent, to be clean. So their motives are corrupted. There's no purity involved in it. There's no honesty involved in it. Their motivation to preach the gospel is purely to work harm on Paul. They want to cause me trouble. The Greek word for trouble means pressure. It's from a root word that means to crowd. Imagine that roaring stream in the mountains that is so crowded by its sides, by mountains, that it rushes down the valley. That's the pressure. Paul says they want to make life difficult for me. Now, I want you to remember some things, because it's easy, I think, to make some false assumptions because of what Paul has said. I want you to remember that Paul could not, did not, had not, would never tolerate a distortion of the gospel that was taught. So when Paul says these individuals are teaching the gospel, they are teaching the gospel. It is not false that they're teaching. This is not a passage that we can go to and say, well, you know what? This preacher in that denomination teaches this, and it's okay for this guy over here to teach a little something different because it's the same gospel. No. Paul would never and hadn't ever allowed that to be. What did he do to Peter in Galatians chapter 2? When Peter was drawn away into this false gospel of the influence of not eating with the Gentiles, Paul said, I resisted him publicly because he was condemned, and he also drug away Barnabas in that heresy. Yeah, Paul would put up with a false gospel? Don't think so. Not if he's resisting Peter, the one who had the keys of the kingdom. Galatians chapter 1, Judaizers. Paul says in the first chapter of Galatians, I'm amazed that you are deserting the gospel and being drawn away into another gospel. Only there are some who would pervert the gospel. And then he makes the bold proclamation, though we or an angel from heaven should preach any gospel other than what has been preached, let him be accursed. And not only does he say it once, the next verse says, so I say again, do you think Paul would put up with a false gospel? Obviously, no way. So the message that he is referencing, that these people are teaching, is the accurate gospel message. It's not corrupted. It's not polluted. The negativity was with the motive, not the message. They were teaching the correct message with a motive to do Paul harm. And again, I want to remind you that Paul finding joy when the pure message was being proclaimed with impure motives should not be equated to his endorsement of corrupt motives. Paul's not saying, hey, it's okay if you can't stand somebody and you want to bring them down, go out and preach. And the reason I know that is because on numerous occasions, the very things that Paul says are motivating these people to go out with the gospel, he condemns. These are not to be Christian behaviors. For example, Does Paul think it's okay to be envious? Yeah, let's see what he said. I fed you milk, not solid food, because you were not yet able to receive it. In fact, you are still not able, because you are still fleshly. For since there is envy and strife among you, you are fleshly, living like ordinary people. Oh, Paul thought it was okay for Christians to be envious. No. Titus 3:3. For we too were once foolish, disobedient, deprived, captive of various passions and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful, detesting one another. That's what we once were. But he moves on and says it's not what we are anymore. So Paul's not saying, okay, it's okay if you harbor envy in your heart. That's a good one. You can work around that. Neither is he endorsing strife. Strife is actually listed in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 20, not as a work of the fruit of the Spirit, but it is a work of the flesh. And Paul discusses in Galatians chapter 5 that those who are walking in step with the Spirit are those who are walking in touch with God. How about rivalry? How about that? Does Paul ever speak against rivalry? Well, we get to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3. Do nothing out of rivalry or conceit, but in humility, like Jesus, consider others as more important than yourself. Everyone should look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. So Paul does not give a stamp of approval on rivalry. How about hurting other people? Is that okay with Paul? Romans chapter 14, verse 15 lets us know, if your brother is hurt by what you eat, you're no longer walking according to love. So Paul plainly teaches that all of those things, envy and strife, rivalry, hurting others, those are not Christian motives. But uniquely, Paul is showing that those devious motives that are motivating people to seek to harm him personally as they proclaim the gospel truth, he's letting people know it's not going to work on me. His heart is still going to rejoice, and it will continue to do so, despite their intentions to do me personal harm. Paul is saying your motivation, although it's impure, although it's unchristian, it's not right. God doesn't approve of those things at all. But you know what? You're teaching Jesus, and you're not going to take my joy away. I'm going to consider what you're doing as valuable. Okay, some heart questions for us to consider from this text, from this incident in the life of Paul. I think the first question is, what gospel are you preaching? What gospel are you? Oh, everybody in this room is preaching the gospel. The only question is, what gospel are we preaching? There is a true gospel and there is a false gospel. There are things that are accurate according to the Word of God. There are things that are inaccurate. And we are the only Bible that some of the world will ever read. So the question bids answering, what gospel does my life preach? Besides our words, what does my life preach? Now let's get down to the nitty. But what is it that's motivating our spiritual service? You know, we learn from these verses, from this text, that it's possible to do some things right, but have the motivation be oh so wrong. It's possible for us to believe that if I show up and get my little taste of God once a week, that's got to be the true gospel. Not so. Not so. My daily walk with the Master leads me to get together with others when they come together, not the other way around. What's my motivation? You know, sometimes this is hard, people. This is really, for us to be honest about our motivation is so difficult. Sometimes we're motivated because we want to be better than somebody else. Sometimes our motivation is how we appear. It's how, I don't want to have a mud pie, so I put on some makeup, but I'm still not the masterpiece. The truth is, every one of us wrestles with the motivation for our spiritual service. I sit in my office and study and pray about stuff and seek to let the text of Scripture live and the Spirit of God work and help me understand things and I labor over things and I discard stuff and put stuff in and then I stand up to present those things and I worry about pleasing people. I worry about hurting someone's feelings. Folks, I'm up here. I stand before you today with mixed motives. And I'm not the only one. We all are a mixture. It's possible for someone to be sitting in this room today and be trying to love the Lord and hate a brother or a sister. And John says you can't do it. But we have mixed motives. Folks, it's no wonder, and this is something we're going to deal more on this evening. It's no wonder that Isaiah said, you take all your righteousness, all the things you do right, all the goodness that you contain, and what do you end up with? A filthy minstrel rag. That's all I can muster. It's all you can come up with. On our own, we're just a bunch of filthy rags sitting around. It's only when our motive is so focused on letting God rule in our lives, becoming obedient as we talked about in class, it's only when that becomes real and overpowers the rest of it that we can say, my motive is honest. My motive is honest. What gospel are you preaching? What's your motivation? And where is your joy in the service, in the ministry? We are so programmed today. Most of us could never get where Paul was. If somebody's out to ruin our reputation, to despise our efforts, to dethrone all that we've stood for and practiced, if someone's out to do that, best most of us will do is say, well, God will judge them. Paul says, I rejoice. Sometimes we just look for the wrong stuff. Even when we're faithful in our ministry, we look for the wrong stuff. Is your joy in ministry when your idea is adhered to 100%? You get your way? There's some who minister, that's their joy. When what I want, I get. Is your joy in ministry when everyone gathers around and does exactly as you think ought to be done? All the programs, all of the efforts, everything just aligns like Aquarius, and everything is beautiful in ministry because it all lines up. What's our joy in ministry? Yes, when we're above budget, I tell you what, that's a joy in ministry. Really? You see, we try all these perimeters. What gospel are we preaching? What's the motivation for us preaching? And what is it that makes our ministry a joy? Paul is in prison. People are out to get him, to destroy him, and he says, I'm happy. Did you really ever think Philippians had this much in it? The only way any of that is going to change is when we recognize that we've been given tremendous opportunities by the salvation of our God through the gift of His Son. He has given into our hands something so precious. It's more important than my will. It's more important than your will. It's more important than who gets credit for whatever. It's more important than our motives. because into our hands the gospel is given.